Welcome back to Questions and Answers. Today for our Q&A we have question 2 by Aiden from Patreon. And Aiden asks a really great question. As someone who blends academic analysis with poetic appreciation, what role do you believe the poet's personal experiences and life choices play in shaping their work? Do you think understanding a poet's life enhances the reader's connection to their poems, or should we focus more on the text itself and its universal themes? This is an important question, and it's one that's more than about the role of the poet in reading poetry, but it's also it's a question about reading. And I think that literature exists for enjoyment, for the joy of the reader, and that books, poems, plays, they all should be judged according to the kind of criticism that they invite. Crucial to this notion of judging literature is this idea of laying aside commitments, prejudices, and even information that you already have, and to approach it with an open mind. But I ultimately believe that the answer to this question actually depends on the kind of reading you're doing. So it's the job of the literary critic to judge a work of art, a poem, let's say, according to how successful it is as a poem. That is, the literary critic is really interested in how well the poem blends sound and sense. How well is that harmony achieved? The intentions of the poet, their ability, their race, their sex, their political politics really shouldn't be considered when weighing the merit of a poem, usually. However, for the rest of us, for the common readers, for whom the poems were actually written, we are invited to read the poems in a number of ways. I'm not sure I believe there's a wrong way to read a poem. I think even misreadings can be really revealing and helpful. But the difficulty here in answering this question is that the poem springs from consciousness, a person's consciousness, sometimes from a collective consciousness, with Carl Jung's theory. But for the individual, it's certainly an individual consciousness, an individual experience, then put into words. It's this vital experience. Keats talks about the negative capability of great art. The idea that the individuality of the poet is not found in its art often. Keats points to Shakespeare as a great example of this. We could also mention Chaucer. We have no idea what Shakespeare was like, other than the fact that he clearly had a really great sense of humor. We don't know where he lived. We don't know his religious views, his political views, but we have some really great art. And it's not a criterion for great art that the poet himself or herself be completely absent. And I would look to Wordsworth, his poetry. I would look to Dickinson's poetry. She seems to be very present in her poems too. And Keats, when he says, so you have the negative capability in Shakespeare, he says you have the exact opposite in Wordsworth, who is just always in his poetry. He's very much present in his poetics. By the way, poetics is a term that means the theory or principles that govern poetry. Wordsworth's poetics were that poetry should speak the language of real men, real people. And that is one of the principles governing his poetics. And so then you have to take that as a criterion for judging his poetry. You can't judge it in the same sense that you would judge an 18th century poet, because he's not trying to play according to those rules. So different poets have different rules. There's really no universal rule for poetry. There's a universal sense of success in that when a poem succeeds, it makes a real aesthetic connection within the reader. And that's probably the only thing that's really universal. And it's something that really can't be measured in terms of a really scientific measurement. Really great art will often have this negative capability where we actually don't need to know much about Shakespeare to enjoy his poetry. However, there are other poems that are connected specifically to conditions. Conditions of circumstance, such as war, disability, the body. To read the war poetry coming out of Ukraine, you have to take into consideration the circumstantial factors that might inform the poetics of that poetry, even though much of it will resonate on a universal level about, the conflict of war, an occupation, but there will be details in there that are circumstantially specific, that are particular. There is the poetry of protest, which often resists traditional form. So you can't judge protest poetry by how well it conforms to the rules of a sonnet. You've got to judge it by something else. In some cases, your knowledge of current events is a prerequisite for enjoying the poems. And this is true for the poetry of race. Some poetry is very racial. So we considered in August on my Patreon course the African American spirituals. Imagine reading the African American spirituals without understanding the people from whence this poetry came. It's absolutely, their conditions were absolutely necessary for appreciating and in some respects making a really great connection with the beauty of the spirituals. So this is where historical context, biographical context, even racial context will come into play. There are also deaf poets, some autistic poets who are writing poetry, and this kind of poetry speaks to experiences not common with every reader, and yet available for every reader's appreciation and interest. So in these cases, I think especially with a lot of contemporary poetry, we are invited to consider the poet's conditions. So one of the reasons why this is an interesting question is because it taps into some of the anxieties that were surrounding the Academy of English Literature and Criticism during the 20th century. In the early 20th century to the mid-20th century, you had formalists who were people who just wanted to consider the poem floating, levitating off the ground and untied to any kind of circumstance, biographical or historical. As many of you know who are familiar with this movement, in America it was called the New Critical Movement or the New Critics. I'm very partial to it because a lot of the criticism I perform in my videos here happens to be close reading, new criticism, in which I'm not really considering the biography. And this method was really helpful in the mid-20th century when you had the introduction of the GI Bill and you suddenly had college classrooms full of men, mostly, who didn't have a quality high school education and had never really delved into the particulars of historical context. And so it was a very accessible way of teaching poetry, a very accessible way of teaching it and encountering the poems. But it's also limited. A work of art does come from its context. You just can't separate it from the context, from the consciousness of the poet. Joseph Campbell talks about the mythogenic zone, out of which, and that's the place where location, nature, manners, culture all form the myths that come out of it. And in a way, you really can't separate the myths from their mythogenic zone. They have to be understood by the people who were in those zones, even though there's a particular universality to certain patterns in myths. But I think of a poem sometimes, a really, really good poem, as, I don't know how else to describe it. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there's the iconography tradition, where many hesychistic icon writers were writing icons of saints, of Christ, of angels, and they were repeating this prayer over and over again. And this prayer and the contemplation allowed them to make the icon a window into the divine. That's kind of how they view it. And I think of poetry as windows into consciousness. It inscribes a certain mode of thinking. It encodes a state of consciousness into language that then becomes accessible to other people. So the word goes out and then makes contact. And when we're reading the poem, we're on the other end of the window looking in. So when we're reading a work of literature, like a poem, for the first time, we should not be concerned with what the author was thinking. You should be considering how it makes you feel. But that's my general rule. Once you've done that, once you've had a really personal encounter with the poem, then you can go on and do the sort of analysis that you want to do. In fact, I'm going to lead you through a couple main theories of literary criticism in theory that have developed over the past 100 years. And you might think of these as lenses that you look through at a poem. And they're shaded lenses. And depending on what shade of lens you have, you'll see different things each time you look through it. So, for example, we have formalism, literary formalism. This is the critical approach that emphasizes the analysis of the text's intrinsic features. Thinking structure, style, imagery, language, all of that independent of biographical, historical context, or any other kind of context. So on Patreon last year, not that long ago, we were reading The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So let's take that as an example. A formalist reading Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner would be interested in its use of symbolism, its meter, its rhyme, its narrative structure, any of the formal properties of the poem. That's what that reading is going to look like. But if you go to a historicist, historicism is the critical approach that interprets a text in relation to the historical context, you'll find a different reading. A historicist is going to be interested in cultural conditions, societal norms, the time of its production. So if a historicist reading Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner is probably going to be really interested in how this poem is reflecting 18th century romantic concerns, such as a fascination with nature, religion. They might also be reading the travel narratives, which was a popular genre at the end of the 18th century, and how this poem is a travel narrative. That's something that a historicist might look at. Then you also have psychoanalysis, which is a literary theory that a lot of critics got a lot of mileage out of. And this applies the principles of psychoanalysis to literature by examining how texts reflect unconscious desires, conflicts, and psychological states in characters, authors, or readers. So a psychoanalyst might interpret Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner as a symbolic journey through the mariner's unconscious or subconscious, as a poem that explores the themes of guilt and repression. So if you were a Freudian, you might look at Coleridge's rhyme and look at that scene where he shoots the albatross, and you might make a lot out of that bolt that penetrates the albatross and kills the bird randomly for no reason, and you might say, oh, well, the mariner did that as an act of sexual repression. You might make a lot out of that crossbow bolt. If you're a Jungian psychoanalyst, you might see the story as a symbolic journey for the mariner to integrate his shadow self. So that's the psychoanalytic view. There's the feminist literary theory, which developed out of the 70s and 80s. It's a critical approach that examines how literature reflects gender roles, reinforces, challenges gender roles, power dynamics, and the representation of women and femininity. I don't know if Coleridge's rhyme would really be a good exploration of this, but a feminist might read the rhyme and explore how there's an absence of female voices. Might also explore the symbolic relation of the moon, which is sometimes connected with femininity. And they also might really be interested in the really strange woman who appears in the ghost ship. I mean, that is a very bizarre scene, and one that I've not really made a lot of sense of myself. So I'd be interested in reading a theory on that. There's more recently something called queer theory, which just kind of explores gender broadly, exploring how texts challenge, construct, or destabilize notions of gender, sexuality, and heteronormativity by often focusing on the marginalized and non-conforming identities. So a queer theorist, if they were to apply their critical approach to Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, perhaps they would focus on the marginalization of the mariner after the transgression of killing the albatross, and how this might reflect certain marginalization that happens with non-conforming identities. They might also focus on the isolation, the guilt, and this liminal space that the mariner goes into. Perhaps, like I said, different types of literature invite different kinds of reading. The other theory, which I think is really helpful for the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, is eco-criticism. This examines the relationship between literature and the environment, considering how texts represent nature, ecological concerns, and human nature dynamic. The ego-critic would read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner as a meditation on humanity's exploitative relationship with nature, and it might also emphasize the mariner's disruption of the natural order and the poem's portrayal of consequences and the interconnectedness of the human and natural world. Finally, and here's to your point, Aidan, a biographical critic would focus on how literature reflects or is informed by the interest and concerns of the author. There's been a lot of great biographical criticism applied to Coleridge in some wonderful biographies that have come out. Usually biographies on poets have some really, really great and insightful biographical criticism, which just makes me love the poem more. But a biographical critic of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner would probably consider how the themes of faith, the struggle with faith, with guilt, with addiction, with transgression, reflect Coleridge's own preoccupations in his own life. This compulsion to do something, to return to something without wanting to or knowing why you do it, I think is a really apt way of reading the poem. So the point of all this is to say that, depending on which theory you choose, certain aspects of the text will come into focus while others blur into the background. But I do want to insist that the important thing is for you to have an experience with the poem on your own, not to worry about what the author's thinking or the poet's thinking. Worry about the poem. Surrender your imagination to it. Let it work upon you before you do any of this stuff on it. You want to maintain a state of receptivity before the art. But for people who then want to learn more about it, are fascinated, maybe are students or graduate students, there are so many ways to read a text, and it's all really helpful. So thanks, Aidan, for the question.